The women buried in this cemetery still glow in the dark. They have been dead for 100 years. Their bones are still faintly radioactive, and they will keep shining underground for another 1,000. Nobody warned them what the paint would do. It began at a factory bench in Orange, New Jersey. It was 1917. In front of a young woman sat a tray of watch faces and a pot of pale paint that glowed faintly green in the dim room. She lifted a fine camel hair brush, touched it to her lips to sharpen the point, and dipped it into the paint. She did this 200 times a day. Nobody had told her what was in the pot. Her name might be Grace Fryer. She has just taken one of the best jobs a working-class girl in America can get. It pays 3 times what she could earn in a laundry or a shop. The paint is called Undark, and the company that makes it says it is perfectly safe. The paint is radium. You need to understand what radium meant in 1917, because it changes everything about how this story feels. Radium was not a warning label. It was a miracle. It was the most exciting substance on Earth. Newspapers said it could add years to your life. You could buy radium water as a health tonic, radium toothpaste to brighten your smile, radium face cream, radium butter, radium chocolate. Rich people paid enormous sums to soak in radium spas. So when these young women were handed a glowing paint and told it was good for them, they had no reason to doubt it. Why would they? Everyone wanted radium. They were being given it for free. They painted numbers onto watch dials so soldiers in the trenches could read the time in the dark. It was patriotic work. The dials had to be exact, the numbers thin and clean, and to get that precision the women needed a perfect point on their brushes. So they were taught a technique. Dip, lip, paint. Dip the brush, draw it between your lips to make the tip sharp, then paint. Dip, lip, paint. 200 dials a shift, every point made with the mouth. Each time a woman pointed her brush on her lips, she swallowed a little radium. Not much, a speck. But she did it thousands of times a week for years. Here is the part that sounds impossible. Radium is chemically similar to calcium. Your body cannot tell the difference. So when the radium entered these women, their bodies welcomed it, carried it through the blood, and laid it down where calcium goes. Into their bones, into their jaws, into their teeth. It settled in and it stayed, and once it was in there, it could never come out. And it was still radioactive. Sitting inside their bones, it kept firing tiny bursts of radiation, day and night, into the living tissue around it. From the inside, in the exact places the body can least afford to lose. But at first, none of them knew any of this. At first, the glow was fun. The dust from the paint settled on everything. It got in their hair and on their clothes and on their skin. When these women walked home after dark, they shimmered. People in town called them the ghost girls, because they glowed faintly in the night like something not quite alive. And the women leaned into it. They painted their fingernails with the stuff to make them shine at dances. They painted their teeth so their smiles would glow when they kissed. One woman painted radium across her whole face for a party, just to see herself gleam in the dark. Picture that. A young woman standing in a dark room, her own face shining back at her from the mirror, delighted. She has no idea that the light she finds so beautiful is the thing that is going to kill her. The first one to fall ill was a woman named Molly Maggia. It started in 1922 with a toothache. The dentist pulled the bad tooth. Then the one next to it started to ache, so he pulled that too. But the holes where the teeth had been did not heal. They filled with pus and blisters. The pain spread through her whole mouth. Then, one day, her dentist reached into her mouth to examine her lower jaw, and the bone came away in his fingers. He did not have to cut it or pull it. It simply lifted out. A few weeks later, the rest of her jaw came out the same way. Her jawbone was disintegrating inside her face. Molly Maggia died in 1922. On her death certificate, the cause was written as syphilis. Remember that word. It comes back. Doctors did not understand what was happening. The women's jaws were rotting and crumbling, a horror that had no name, so they invented one. They called it radium jaw. But calling it something is not the same as understanding it. And the young women kept going to work, kept pointing their brushes on their lips, because no one in a position of authority had told them to stop. Somebody, though, did know. And this is where the story turns from tragedy into something colder. The men who ran the radium industry were not ignorant. In the laboratories where the radium was handled by chemists and executives, those men used lead screens. They handled the radium with ivory, tipped tongs held at arm's length. They wore lead aprons. They knew, precisely, that radium was dangerous, because they were protecting themselves from it every single day. The women pointing brushes on their lips a few rooms away were given nothing. No warning, no screen, no apron, nothing. And when the illnesses could no longer be hidden, the U.S. Radium Corporation did not admit fault. It hired experts to produce reassuring reports. When one investigation found the paint was harming the women, the company submitted an altered version to state officials and buried the real findings. And when the women started dying, the company reached for the cruelest defense it could find. It suggested the women were not sick from radium at all. It suggested they had syphilis. Now you understand why Molly Maggia's death certificate said what it said. Blaming syphilis did two things at once. It protected the company from blame, and it destroyed the women's reputations, painting them as immoral in an age when that word could end a life. The company was not just poisoning them. It was prepared to shame them into silence over their own graves. But one of them would not go quietly. Her name was Grace Fryer, and she may well be the woman we started with, standing at that bench in 1917. By the time Grace decided to fight, her spine was collapsing and she had to wear a steel back brace just to sit upright. Her teeth were gone. It took her 2 years just to find a lawyer willing to take on a corporation this powerful. 4 more dying women joined her. The newspapers called them the Radium Girls. When they finally walked into court, some of them could no longer raise their arms to take the oath. They were so weakened by the radium in their bones that they could barely lift a hand. They were fighting a clock, and they knew it. Doctors testified that none of the 5 would likely live more than a few months. They settled in 1928. Each woman received some money and, more importantly, forced the danger into the open where it could no longer be denied. There was one man whose work made it undeniable. A pathologist named Harrison Martland developed the tests that proved, beyond argument, that the radium was inside these women, still radioactive, still burning them from within. He could measure the radiation coming off their bodies, off their breath, off their bones. The proof was not a document that could be altered. The proof was the women themselves, quietly glowing on the inside. And that is the detail that stays with you. The radium never left them. It is still there now, in the bones of the women buried in cemeteries across New Jersey and Illinois, faintly radioactive to this day, and it will keep glowing in the dark of those graves for over 1,000 years. The very light they once painted on their fingernails for a dance is still shining, long after everything else about them is gone. Their deaths were not wasted. Because these 5 women refused to be shamed into silence, the law changed. The right of a worker to sue an employer for an occupational disease, something we now take completely for granted, was carved out in part by dying women who could barely lift their arms in the courtroom. Every safety rule that protects you at your own job stands on a foundation these women paid for with their jaws, and their spines, and their lives. So think again about that woman in the dark, delighted by her own glowing face in the mirror. She thought the light was a gift. She thought the company giving it to her wished her well. The most dangerous poison is rarely the one that announces itself. It is the one that arrives looking like a miracle, handed to you by someone smiling, who already knows exactly what it will do.